Good afternoon, everybody, and whatever time of day it is in the zone that you're in, a good bat to you. This is part of the ongoing series that's being organized by the Center for Indian Studies in Africa and the University of Ahmedabad, where Professor Tejaswini Niranjana is. And the idea is that of thinking with the idea of Indian Ocean and beyond, and also thinking from Gujarat or thinking from the coast to the vast geographies that the coast connects to. And for those of you who have been diligent and devoted and who have been attending our earlier seminars, you'll have seen that there's a wide variety of work. We've had people like Ranisa Mawani, Jyoti Gulati, Jatin Dua, and now the latest in the series is Fahad Bishara. I am from the Center for Indian Studies in Africa at the University of Witwatersrand. My name is Dilip Menon. We do oceanic histories and knowledge from the global south. And we're delighted to have Fahad present today. So over to Teju to tell you a bit about her center.
Welcome to everyone on behalf of the Center for Inter-Asian Research. We've had this wonderful partnership with Dilip Menon Center, CISA, at the University of Witwatersrand. And we have an entire year's worth of talks for you on the Indian Ocean and beyond. Very often focusing on the Gujarat as a sort of jumping off point, if you like. We have already many more people entering, so I'm scrambling to admit them as I speak. But for more information about our center, please look up Ahmedabad University and CIAR, which is Center for Inter-Asian Research. We do tons of things, including the Indian Ocean webinars, and you can write in and ask to be put on our mailing list. So whether you're in Ahmedabad or not doesn't matter. Many of our events are virtual, several are not, but you will come to know at least what's happening at the center. So let me now introduce the speaker. I've nearly finished his first book on law and debt in the Western Indian Ocean region. And it's called A Sea of Debt, Law and Economic Life in the Western Indian Ocean, 1780 to 1950. Fahad Bishara is Associate Professor of History at the University of Virginia. He is currently working on a history of the dhow trade between the Persian Gulf and the Indian Ocean, anchored in the voyages of a Kuwaiti dhow captain in the early 1920s. I think you can see from the abstract of today's talk how this might connect also to the earlier work, the first book, The Sea of Debt, which I'm finding quite enchanting. Because one is often used to thinking of traders as being part of the economic life of a region or the ocean in this instance. But one never really thinks of them as agents of history, as Fahad Bishara so eloquently puts it. And I'm sure that in the current, the work, the biography of Al-Sudairawi, he's going to be looking at this kind of person, this figure, as also one of those agents of history. This allows us to look at the region and the history of capitalism in the region in a much larger frame than is customary, right? Importantly, I think in Bishara's work, he tries to show how the world of Indian Ocean trade is also one of law. And it's a story of changing institutions which also work with Islamic law. Interpersonal relationships, say between the Kachi merchants and people like the Sultan of Muscat or Oman, that these interpersonal relations are also shaped by or structured by law. And I find this like something so clearly put that I have not often thought of these two things together, but then you begin to see why it would be interesting to have this emphasis. I think the other important part of Fahad Bishara's work is that he's really giving voice to many of the sort of the traders, the merchants, other migrants, whether they're Gujarati or whether Hindu Gujarati or Bora or Omani or Shirazi, that these people who remake the boundaries between law, empire, and economic life, as he puts it so well, these are the kind of people that he's focusing on. And I leave you with this last thought, which from his first book, where you have a custom master customs master, and a sultan coming together in a common enterprise. How might that work? I think we are going to have more insights into this process in the current talk. So, Fahad, welcome, a very warm welcome to you. You can speak for about 40 minutes, 45 minutes, and that'll be followed by a couple of questions from me, if I have any, and questions from the audience. So, please go ahead and share your PPT.
Good. Can you see it?
Yes.
It's visible. It's visible. Okay, great. Well, I mean, first, thank you, Tejaswini, for the lovely introduction. Thank you for the invitation, and thank you, Dilip, as well, for inviting me to do this. Although, you know, at 8:30 in the morning in Virginia time, I didn't feel so warm an hour ago. But I'm grateful to all the institutions that made this possible as well. It really is a privilege, and you know, as we all return to in-person talks and things like that, to continue to be able to nurture these virtual connections that allow us to speak across oceans and continents. So I'm drawing the material that I'm sharing with you today from the book project that I'm working on, which is a microhistory of a dhows voyage around the Indian Ocean in the 1920s, set against the backdrop of a much broader world of capitalism and empire. And it really is a connected history of the Gulf, the Persian Gulf and Indian Ocean. That's the book. But as I was writing the chapter on Bombay, each chapter in the book, to give some of it away, each chapter is written around a particular stop in this dhow's itinerary. As I was writing this chapter on Bombay, I began to dig into this material that I collected. And over the course of the next several months, I came to see there was perhaps a separate project in that material as well. And that's a project that I may or may not ever write. I don't know, but I thought to present on it anyway. So there are two parts to this story, this presentation, maybe three. There's the story of Arab Bombay, or how Bombay came to be fused into the Arab world, how it came to be part of these Arab oceanic circuits, particularly Gulf Arab oceanic circuits. And then from there, as I sort of map out this broad world of Arab Bombay through the life and trials of Mohammed Salem Al-Sudairawi, I'm going to dive into a very particular set of issues, thinking about different circuits of this history from the vantage point of the center of colonial capitalism, thinking about specifically about money transfers and the ways in which people grappled with the implications of new forms of money transfer in the Indian Ocean. So you'll see echoes of my first book in this. One, you know, one realizes when you're thinking through these things that there's actually a much broader world of sort of credit and financial transfers that's taking place. And in my book, although I covered some of it, there's just so much more left to say. And so I'm using this occasion to sort of connect the dots between them as well. And I'm sure that I will have worn out my welcome very soon, but I'm also sure that Dilip will let me know when I've gone over time, which warning I will promptly ignore and continue to speak.
Go for it.
In any case, let's begin. Let me see. There we go. So meet Mohammed Salem Al-Sudairawi, a Kuwaiti merchant and banker who resided in Bombay at the turn of the century and for the first 2 decades of the 20th century. The Sudairawi family came to Kuwait during the 19th century, and then having migrated from Central Arabia, from Sudair, which is where they get their name from. Sudairawi's grandfather, his grandfather in the mid-19th century, was a horse trader. His father was a horse trader as well. His father set up shop in Bombay and imported horses from the Arabian Peninsula by way of Kuwait into India. He would sell them locally. There was a major market for Arabian horses in India itself, but many were also transshipped to Europe, to Australia, to other parts of the globe by way of the sort of increasing sort of steamship network, the growing steamship network. Al-Sudairawi, Mohammed Salem Al-Sudairawi arrived in Bombay with his father, who in 1898, his father, Salem Al-Sudairawi, was appointed by the Kuwaiti ruler, Mubarak al-Sabah, as his agent in that port city. This meant a lot of things, actually, being the ruler's agent. It's totally unclear as a category, I should say. Lots of people were considered the ruler's agents in different places, and they just did all sorts of different things. Much of it meant looking after property that the ruler owned in Bombay, but much of it meant sort of facilitating the commercial activities of this growing network of Kuwaiti merchants around the Indian Ocean in the late 19th century. We actually don't know a whole lot about what Salem Al-Sudairawi did in Bombay. He dies in 1906 during one of the many bouts of plague that erupt in that port city in the early 1900s. In 1906, Salem Sudairawi succumbs to the plague, and his son Mohammed, at the age of 30, takes over his father's work as quote-unquote the ruler's agent in Bombay. His materials tell us a little bit more about what that means, but they also tell us a much broader story, the story of Gulf capitalism in Bombay in the early 20th century and their entanglement with imperial institutions around the Indian Ocean. For a merchant like Sudairawi, indeed for many others, there was really no better place to be than Bombay. Bombay was the site of all manner of manufacturing, particularly in textiles, and these Gulf merchants did a lot of business in textiles. Bombay was also the terminus of railroads, for railroads coming in or sort of converging in that city from around the subcontinent. It was the center of a growing Indian cotton economy in the 19th century, and as such was also the center for banking, for much of the banking in banking institutions, I should say, European banking institutions in the subcontinent. Of course, as we all know, the cotton economy experiences a major bust during the 1860s. But then the city survives this sort of major shock to its economy and reconstitutes itself in various ways. Merchants are involved in lots of different sectors, and particularly with the rise of the sort of growing global steamship network, Bombay becomes a critical node in this global capitalist economy. By the late 19th century, Bombay is arguably the mercantile metropolis of the Indian Ocean world. There's virtually no other place in the Western Indian Ocean, at least, that rivals Bombay, which is surprising, actually, given that I should say this, and maybe I'm speaking from some ignorance, but there's not a whole lot of scholarship on 19th century Bombay, on capitalism 19th century Bombay. There is some, but it's really disproportionate to the city's importance. You know, in any case, the only other place that might approximate Bombay actually is Karachi, which emerged as something of a sister city to Bombay in the late 19th century. Bombay was also an administrative center in the Indian Ocean. It was a place from which British officials fanned out into different ports in the region, in the Gulf, in South Arabia, and East Africa. British officials were all appointed by and answered to the government of Bombay specifically. Aden, which I'll speak about briefly later on, but Aden was actually a district of the Bombay presidency, though not nearly as neat as that, as I'll discuss later. Many of the Gulf merchants who did business in Bombay also did business in southern Iraq, where they owned date farms. Bombay during the 19th century also housed an Ottoman consul who routinely handed out Turkish flags and safe conduct passes to Gulf dhows and dhow captains moving back and forth between Basra and India. But Bombay was also a place of exile, sometimes self-imposed. Arab rulers would come there, would visit, would stay, would die. The sons of Sa'id bin Sultan, the Sultan of Muscat and Zanzibar, were all at different times sent to Bombay for different reasons. His son Barghash was exiled to Bombay for a couple of years after a failed coup attempt against his brother after his father's death in 1856. And the lore has it that he was so impressed by all of the urban infrastructure they had seen in Bombay that he decided that he would go back and be a good sultan in Zanzibar and listen to the instructions of the British consul. Of course, the truth is much more complicated than that. Barghash's brother Turki also ended up in Bombay after his father's death, the time between his father's death and between his takeover of Muscat from his nephew. This is where he would bide his time. Actually, he was living in abject poverty in Bombay, I should say. There were other more high-profile ones, or those were the more high-profile ones, I should say. Rulers in what's today Bahrain, Qatar, and the United Arab Emirates, and during the 19th century, were all frequently exiled to Bombay after failed attempts at dislodging one another. This was in some ways, it was the penal station of the Indian Ocean as well. Perhaps there are better lodgings there than elsewhere, and not all were forced to go. In Al-Sudairawi's time, the Omani Sultan Timur bin Faisal left to Bombay on his own accord after he abdicated the throne. So Bombay is on the political map in various ways. And actually, just a week ago, the Kuwait Times published this lovely piece on this one particular graveyard in Bombay, which I've not had the pleasure of going to this particular graveyard, a place where Kuwaiti merchants and Gulf other Gulf personnel were buried. Those who died in Bombay were buried there. So it's on the political map in various ways, which is partly why somebody like Mohammed Al-Sudairawi would end up there. From Bombay, you had your finger on the sort of executive pulse, the administrative pulse of the Indian Ocean world, and you could access all sorts of different figures. Bombay was also a particularly good place to be a merchant. It was the main market for pearls, which were the principal high-value commodity traded out of the Gulf in the 19th and early 20th century. A discussion of the pearl dive is beyond the scope of what I can cover here, but I want to say that the pearl dive constituted one of the largest sectors of the Gulf's maritime economy. Every summer, tens of thousands of divers would sail out to the pearl banks on dhows, diving for pearl oysters that they'd shuck on board the dhow. They'd hand over the pearls, whatever pearls they'd find, to their captain. Merchants in the Gulf, many of whom had partners in Bombay, would finance these pearling vessels. They'd give money and goods on credit to the captains, who would then parcel that money and goods, that credit, out to the mariners. And the proceeds from the season's catch would be applied to the debt. In good years, it'd be enough to work off the debt and maybe earn a little bit extra, but most of the time it was not enough, and the cycle of debt would continue. This theme of debt is one that I take up in enormous detail in my book, and it's one that's actually quite pervasive in the history of the Indian Ocean world. The merchants themselves, of course, often did quite well, and those who were in Bombay sometimes amassed fabulous amounts of wealth from the pearl trade. The merchant Jasim al-Ibrahim, for example, was one of the pearl kings of Bombay. His family owned thousands of acres of date plantations, date farms in Basra as well. And one of his cousins wielded enormous political power in Kuwait and southern Iraq. Jasim himself did quite well too. He bought a lavish house in Kaf Parade, a sort of posh suburb of Bombay. The house is still there, actually, although it's been divided up into different residential units, but you can still see the structure itself. Of course, he was one of many Gulf merchants in Bombay who made their money off the pearl trade. There were dozens of others like him, and there were dozens of others who had little to do with pearls, actually, and focused their business activities in other sectors. There's the Al-Bassam family of Unayza in the Saudi interior, who are known for their involvement in the textile trade. Actually, you can still purchase Al-Bassam textiles in any mall in the Gulf today. They're considered luxury textiles. There are the Al-Fadl brothers, who were principally dealing in dates and other goods, and there were many others who dealt in who sort of bought and sold all sorts of different goods. And this was the community to which Mohammed Salem Al-Sudairawi principally belonged, a community of Arab traders from around the Gulf who were active in lots of different sectors and who embedded themselves in Bombay's commercial society. Bombay was not some sort of commercial outpost for them either. For many, Bombay was actually home. This is where they were born. This is where they were raised. This is where they went to school. These Gulf communities were their family members, were their friends, were their cousins. They celebrated different occasions with them. We have lots of sort of communiques between different merchants there, talking about Eid celebrations, talking about different banquets, talking about different events that they would all be going to together. They established a school there, an Arabic school for their children in Bombay. It was actually, for many of them, it was the Gulf itself that was the foreign place. And we have a terrific set of oral histories collected by Rashad Duwaisan. She published it as an MA thesis, which she interviewed the sort of returning children of these Gulf merchants who returned to the Gulf in the mid 20th century, and were actually shocked by what they saw there. They experienced enormous culture shock. These are people who were, who had come from these very cosmopolitan places and mixed with boys and spoke Hindustani quite fluently, and then returned home and felt like they were they landed on the moon or something like that. Returned home. There's not their home. They returned to this strange place that people told them was home. Bombay was also a center, and this is something that we know a little bit less about. Bombay was a center for Arab printing, actually. Beginning in the late 19th century, Gulf Arabs and others regularly printed books in Bombay. They printed manuals on the pearl trade, manuals on navigation. They printed treatises on religion, treatises on law, treatises on all sorts of different things. They printed even printed newspapers. By the 1930s, they produced their own newspaper there, or I should say journal, Majallat al-Arab, that spoke to the concerns of the Arab community of Bombay. But that's only a small part of the story of Bombay and Arab printing. Part of what I began to realize is the degree to which Bombay was actually connected to the story of the Arab intellectual renaissance, the Nahda, in the 19th and early 20th centuries, which is one of the major events or major processes, I should say, that Middle East historians study. And oftentimes that's a history that is rooted in the stories of thinkers and editors and journalists in the Eastern Mediterranean, Mohammed Abdu, Rashid Rida, lots of others. But I want to sort of shift the focus to Bombay a little bit, and I'll say a little bit now, and I'll say a little bit more later on. But first of all, Sudairawi and the Arab merchants of Bombay were active consumers of publications produced in Egypt and the Levant. They subscribed to different newspapers and journals there and would circulate them actually to readers in the Gulf, and they helped expand a growing Arab public sphere in doing so. But this is the other part of the story that fewer people know. They also helped finance many of these presses. Sudairawi frequently sent money to the journalist Abdul Masih Antaki, the editor of the journal Al-Umran, or the newspaper Al-Umran. And Gulf merchants in Bombay, Jassim Ibrahim especially, but also others, regularly hosted visits from Arab intellectuals and would finance their presses, including Rashid Rida, who I'll talk about soon, but who did visit Bombay, spent an enormous amount of time with the Sudairawi and Ibrahim and others, and was able to fundraise for Al-Manar, his journal, this journal that absolutely transformed the religious landscape of the Middle East in the early 20th century. Here we might think of Niall Green's terrific work on the opening up of religious public sphere in Bombay with the advent of cheap printing, cheap publications. By thinking through Sudairawi, though, we see that it's not just Bombay printing that's made its way into the port city and beyond. But the Bombay capital, I should say, Bombay capital finances print elsewhere as well. So the public sphere that Niall Green talks about, he couches it as a religious economy. But anyway, we might think of it as a public sphere actually emerges within Bombay and well beyond it as well. And that Bombay, we might think of Bombay as part of that story. I'll say very briefly, I know I'm going to I have many more things to say, and I don't want to spend too much time on this. Happy to talk more about it. But the Arab merchants of Bombay very briefly also experimented with running their own steamship company. They established their own steamship company. They purchased vessels from Europe, from European shipping companies, rebranded them, and sent them around the Western Indian Ocean themselves. They ultimately failed. It's only a 4-year venture. But it's an interesting story in that they thought it was possible to break into this particular sector and incorporate these what we might think of as imperial technologies like the steamship into their repertoires. Happy to talk more about that later on. But this is all by way of setting the stage, really. Sort of establishing the place of Bombay as actually in some ways a metropolis of the Arab world as well. It's not just some foreign port city. It's in some ways an Arab metropolis as much as it is anything else. And Sudairawi, as you'll see by all of the letters that are addressed to him, he's involved in all of these different sectors. He's involved in printing, he's financing these sorts of things. He's actually one of the directors of the Arab Steamship Company. But his main work, actually, the reason why he's involved in so many different endeavors, his main work was in banking. Sorry, I didn't have room to label all of these. This is a letter to Sudairawi over here from one of his correspondents in Aden. And this is a very typical letter from Sudairawi's. I'll talk about what these contain in a little bit. This here is a hawala money transfer, actually from Basra itself, and this is a specimen of a banknote from the Imperial Bank of India's branch in Bombay. So, like I said, Sudairawi's main work is in banking. We actually have 15,000 letters addressed to Sudairawi. This is the family's collection, which I've had the enormous fortune of working in. Includes 15,000 letters, enormous amount of letters all over the course of 9 years in the 19 teens. But they're all letters addressed to him, to Sudairawi. Very few of them involve Sudairawi writing, right? So these are all incoming letters. And virtually all of them involve money transfers, right? His correspondence all include different credit notes in their letters from people that they're doing business with and ask him to credit them to accounts that they have in Bombay. This is a very typical letter that he gets in which they say they send greetings, they tell him of whatever letters they might have received from their end, and then from his end, and then they say, look, we are also included in this letter, are these different checks, these different hawalas, different banknotes, and they use those terms, hawalas, orders to transfer money from one person to another, but then they also use the term thak, hik, or note. The plural of note is of course anwat, so notes, anwat. So checks and banknotes referred to in the vernacular. And there are just, like I said, 15,000 letters, virtually all of which, there are some exceptions, of course, but virtually all of which make the same sort of request. An interesting note on these, although virtually every letter to Sudairawi mentions these instruments, none of those letters actually include those instruments. None of those instruments made their way into the family collection. They're in a sense phantom instruments. But so I include these images to the right to show you what these might have looked like, because we have these from other collections. So they send these money orders, various kinds of money orders, hawalas, money transfers, checks, notes to Sudairawi, and then ask him to credit their accounts or to credit somebody else's account. Essentially, Sudairawi's work is he receives information on transactions taking place in other port cities, and he moves money from one account to another to ensure that there is credit available. There's money available for those merchants to be able to do that kind of business or to meet their obligations to one another. So this is principally the work that he's doing. And in collecting these money notes and in moving funds from one account to another, Sderawi is actively turning the wheels of credit, the finances, transactions taking place around the Western Indian Ocean. He is, in some ways, like a central node in this, in what Rajat Kantare called the sort of the bazaar, the Indian Ocean bazaar, right? This money market that stretches out from India to the Persian Gulf, South Arabia, East Africa, Southeast Asia, and other places. And Sderawi, this is why Sderawi's network of correspondence is so wide. I mean, 15,000 letters from hundreds of different correspondents around the Western Indian Ocean is because he is the principal banker to this community in some ways. He is the person who's making the credit available to them. So we have a Kuwaiti merchant in the heart of one of the centers of colonial capitalism in British India, taking notes, checks, and other forms of banking paper, fueling the coffers of credit around the Western Indian Ocean. For me, this immediately raised the question of how he might have understood his own activities, brokering between the world of high finance and the bazaars of the Western Indian Ocean. And one of the curious things about this Sderawi's archive, which I've already mentioned, of course, is that we have very, very few letters written by Sderawi himself. Virtually all of the archive, with the exception of maybe 3 or 4, all of the archive are letters addressed to him, and nothing is from him. So we see how these notes enter into the commercial. Here we already see how these notes enter into the commercial vernacular as shikat, anwat, things like that. But we might understand these as being intertwined with all of the financial instruments that were already making their way around the Western Indian Ocean marketplace. The waraqas that I had written about in the past, the hawalas, which we already know something about in the literature, and other credit notes that people had relied upon for so long. How do these work alongside one another? We might think of them as simply operating in parallel with one another, right? And the work of the Sderawi, and we might think of the work of Sderawi as coordinating the movement of different kinds of notes into different kinds of accounts. But we might also think of the ways in which notes like this enter into a contractual imaginary, a legal imaginary. We might say, how they are domesticated by merchants like Sderawi. And of course, there are many others like him. If you'll allow me to pivot for 1 second to Kuwait. The jurist, the Kuwaiti jurist, Abdullah Hayyan, a contemporary of Sderawi's, is asked a question by a merchant about zakat, about the zakat obligations, about the alms obligations that they owe on banknotes, specifically on banknotes, the very sorts of notes that they'd be sending to Sderawi. Rather than take on the question himself, the jurist is, of course, Hayyan is asked the question by a merchant. He doesn't want to answer the merchant directly. He seems kind of wary of taking on the merchants in Kuwait, who are a bit of a power block. So instead, he forwards the question to his teacher, the Damascus jurist Ibn Badran. Ibn Badran takes up this question of zakat obligation and banknotes, and he rephrases it actually in a really, really, really interesting way. He asks, do banknotes and postal transfers, this is the other thing that they're asking about, do banknotes and postal transfers constitute money as such, or did they simply represent value in a different form? Were they forms of currency? Did they have value in and of themselves as forms of property, corporate property, ayn, or were they really only paper instruments that ultimately emerged from a relationship of debt? These were useful questions for him to consider in the abstract, but also had real life implications, of course. Whether zakat could be collected on them was directly related to whether or not they were actually money, right? Were they money or were they debt, right? And whether and on what terms their bearer could transfer them to another party. In his long answer to this question, the jurist declares his stance almost immediately, actually. He says, banknotes and postal transfers could not be considered to be money as such, right? They were lacking money's most essential characteristic, intrinsic value. The lack of intrinsic value in the instruments, of course, doesn't render them useless. They're in fact quite useful, but as guarantees of debts incurred for an item of value, a good or a currency, that had been sold before it physically changed hands. They were, in a sense, these banknotes were representations of value rather than forms of value in and of themselves. Now, this was interesting enough, but what really got me was how Ibn Badran justifies his answer. He does it by placing the banknote itself within a longer history of Western banking, right? He starts with the history of banking in the Italian republics, in Venice and Genoa, and then he moves on to the Hanseatic League and the Netherlands, and he gives establishment dates for different banks around Europe. It's an amazing fatwa, actually. And he maps out a history of shifting banking practices from loaning to people to loaning to governments, right, in Europe, and the emergence of banknotes within that process, within that shift from sort of loans to people, peer-to-peer loans, and loans to governments. And he does this all to make the point that banknotes, even in European history, were fundamentally credit instruments and functioned in very different ways than sort of metallic currency did, right? Now, we can take issue with some details in his narrative, but it's a fascinating one, especially as he then proceeds to place this narrative alongside a genealogy of credit instruments in Muslim thought. He talks about, he gives a long history of practices surrounding what he calls sukuk, different paper instruments in the Islamic world, actually from the first century Hijri, the first Hijri century. And he quotes different jurists, and he cites different practices, credit instruments surrounding credit instruments that people began to use as negotiable paper, meaning they would transfer them among themselves, almost like cash. Ibn Badran sort of maps this all out and outlines all of the competing opinions on that practice, but marshals them all towards his fundamental point, that these were credit instruments, not cash, right? That they transferred guarantees between people rather than being constitutive of value as such. And in his answer, he reflected that this was that this also reflected. He stated this also reflected contemporary concerns. In his answer, he referred to scholars in India, in Java, and in Cairo, all of whom grappled with identical issues and who turned up different answers, of course. Ultimately, the decision that Ibn Badran arrives at, I mean, it's an interesting decision, but the decision itself doesn't interest me as much. What interests me is that Ibn Badran found it useful to intertwine the history of financial instruments in capitalist centers in Europe to those in the Islamic world, right? What he's doing is intertwining a history of banking in the West to a history of banking in the Islamic world. And then he's bringing this history to bear on the kinds of instruments Al-Sudairawi circulated. As he's doing that, he's entering them into a sort of a Muslim legal episteme, we might say, right? He's opening a space in which people like Al-Sudairawi could take those instruments and actually domesticate them, truly domesticate them, right? Understand them as being a intertwined part of Muslim financial practice. And so the shekat, the anwat, and all of the rest of the instruments could circulate alongside the hawalas, the sukuk, etc., all on very much the same terms. Not everybody would have agreed with Ibn Badran's reasoning or his answer, of course. In Lior Halavi's book, Modern Things on Trial, which
Fahad, sorry, you have to wind up.
I told you I would ignore the warning. So I'll take it.
Second warning.
I'll take it as a 5-minute warning. In Lior Halavi's book, he recalls how in 1902, the Bahraini merchant Muqbil al-Dakhir wrote to Rashid Rida, the editor of Al-Manar, and a global reformist thinker, asks very similar question to that Hayyan asked Badran. He asked about banknotes and their place and their use in place of silver and gold rupees. Are they to be treated as currency? What were the implications for usury, for zakat, etc.? And Rida took a different position. He said that banknotes were currency and their usage was permissible and entailed the same obligations. And I find this opinion, Rida's opinion, particularly interesting given the ways in which he moved within the circuits of finance in the Western Indian Ocean. He was, as you recall, one of the beneficiaries of Gulf commercial activity in Bombay. His journal was in part financed through Bombay money, and here he writes he has a beautiful write-up of his visit to India. And I should also point out that Rada's questioner, Muqbil al-Dakhir, was also one of Al-Sudairawi's associates and correspondents. Rada's opinion tells me less about what banknotes are or aren't. I'm less interested in that, and more about the intertwining of circuits of finance and circuits of ideas in this part of the Indian Ocean world. He visits British India in 1912. He delivers a lecture in Lucknow to the Dar al-Ulum, the Nadwat al-Ulama in Dar al-Ulum, I should say, in Lucknow. Visits again in 1915 to fundraise for his journal. Spends some time on his way back with the merchant Yusuf al-Zawawi, who is one of Al-Sudairawi's associates, frequently forwards money transfers from Gujarati merchants in Muscat, actually, to Bombay. And I was going to spend some time thinking about Bombay, Aden. I want to say briefly, in 1928, Sudairawi declares bankruptcy. We don't know exactly why, and I'm still trying to dig into that part of the story. But the bankruptcy, we might use it to think about the circuit of colonial law in the Western Indian Ocean, the relationship between British courts and jurisdiction. There are British political agents, of course, around the Western Indian Ocean, in Bahrain, and Aden, and Zanzibar. But the relationship of those forums to metropolitan centers like Bombay was always pretty ambivalent. British Indian law and code would sometimes make its way into these courts, but there's nothing resembling a formal process of appeal from places like Bahrain to Bombay. One of our students here in the department, Robin Morse, who's actually, I believe she's in this audience, is writing about this. Even in Aden, which is administratively a district of Bombay, the relationship of Aden Residence Court and the Bombay High Court was actually unclear. Did the Bombay courts have a right to review decisions in Aden? Was there a right of appeal? These are questions that judges frequently asked themselves over and over again in the 19th century, and ultimately the relationship between Aden and Bombay, and Aden is again an administrative district of Bombay. It's part of the Bombay presidency. The legal relationship between them is totally ambivalent and unclear to everybody, right? Very rarely did things work smoothly in terms of legal decision making around the Indian Ocean. Unlike, say, or this corner of the Indian Ocean, unlike, say, in Zanzibar, where merchants in the 19th century did routinely appeal to India or to Bombay. From Aden, from Bahrain, from other places, this was the circuitry was just not as smooth. Okay, I'll wrap up now, I promise. Okay, what does the story of Mohammed al-Sudairawi tell us? I love this photograph, by the way, and it's going to be my life's work for the next several years to figure out who the hell these people are. But we do have, I should say, Mohammed al-Sudairawi is right here. A young Mohammed al-Sudairawi is right here. You see him, clean shaven, boyish, with a boyish face. His story ultimately tells us a few things. First, what I hope is clear enough is that people thought of Bombay as part of an Arab world, right? They might not have thought of it as Arabic as such, but they certainly engaged with it as a regional metropolis and routed many of the currents of commerce, politics, and thought through that city, through Bombay. That's a broad claim, though, and I spent much of this talk taking on something a bit more specific. It was in Bombay that Gulf merchants actively straddled the boundaries between colonial capitalism and the worlds of the bazaar that they had emerged from. I'd say they did more than that. They fused together the vernacular and imperial, the vernacular and sort of European contractual worlds. They took the instruments of global finance and domesticated them, anchoring them in the vernacular and in pre-existing ideologies and circuits of finance. In a sense, we might think of Indian Ocean capitalism as a co-creation, like a co-creation involving merchants like Al-Sudairawi. Merchants in the Indian Ocean didn't passively position themselves around an expanding colonial capitalism, even in places like Bombay. They actively incorporate its technologies into their repertoire and direct them towards their own markets and their own ends. This is one of the many stories of what we might think of as a history of convergence in the history of capitalism, rather than the histories of divergence that we often are told. And that's maybe what's gained from thinking about this story from a micro level than a macro level. The distinctions that we make from the parachutist perspective of the bazaar and the bank, divergences, these are helpful ones. But when we look closely from the vantage point of the merchant's office, the boundaries appear a little fuzzier than they might otherwise seem. Mohammed Salem Al-Sudairawi isn't exceptional in this regard. He is one of hundreds of others like him, all of whom made life worlds, and not just life worlds, helped animate entire regional economies from their place in that city. To finish with a phrase that I might borrow from the master, Carlo Ginzburg, about Mohammed Al-Sudairawi, we know many things. About the hundreds, if not thousands of others, we know nothing. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Fahad, and I'm glad that you disregarded all the many reminders.
I apologize.
Yeah,
My Zoom manner needs some work, clearly.
that was totally fine because I think it allowed you to uh, make a certain set of concluding remarks. I'm sure people have many, many questions, but I was struck personally by um, how in the first book you talk about the Kachi merchants, the Gujarati merchants, making a home in the Gulf, and to such an extent that they sort of replicate their own lifestyles, etc. there. Of course, they were going into a different space than colonial Bombay. And if the Kuwaiti merchants made Bombay their home, did they need to put in the same kind of labor as maybe the Kachi merchants in the Gulf? In terms of the recognition of religious beliefs or certain kinds of practices of burning versus burial. I know this might seem a bit tangential to the main argument that you're making, but I also see it as related to the whole question of vernacular capitalism. That if you are talking about the financial instruments that people were using to make themselves at home, then I wondered what other practices were required to support that.
No, that's an excellent question, and I don't think it's I don't think it's tangential to the issue at all, as you say. And I have to say that I don't have an excellent answer for you, but part of this story, this history of Arab Bombay or Khaliji Bombay, we might say, is the story of making a home in the port city, and it's not an obvious process. One only needs to compare it to, and I have a chapter in my book, the book that I'm writing, one that's the chapter on Calicut, actually, and we have one Kuwaiti merchant that ends up in Calicut in the 1920s, and this person really feels adrift in Calicut and constantly talks about how he wishes he was in Bombay instead. Because that there are so many more other people like him in Bombay, and in Calicut he was the only one. And so we don't take it for granted that people are able to make a home in these port cities. Of course, a city like Bombay, which is much more sort of cosmopolitan in character, where you have merchant communities from around the Indian Ocean world who are coming and setting up quarters. We might think of it as a slightly smoother process. We have Gulf Arab neighborhoods that emerge in Bombay. First, for some time, they all seem to have business offices in the same building, in one of the blocks of the Sitaram building, which Niall Green, famous, which the collapse of which I should say Niall Green famously narrates at the beginning of his book, Bombay Islam. And then they all cluster around similar streets, Arab Gully, they call it in Bombay, and Johann Matthew wrote a little bit about that once some time ago. But I would say that they have to lobby as well for certain privileges within the city. It's not straightforward. It's not very clear that they ought to be able to have a newspaper for themselves in the city, for example, or establish a school for themselves. This takes getting some permission and some coordination between the merchants in Bombay, the officials there, the rulers in the Gulf, corresponding with political agents, asking for particular kinds of privileges. So do they put in the same kind of labor that Kachis in the Gulf and in East Africa do? I would say that for Kachis in the Gulf, it's probably a bit more of an uphill battle. You're asking for privileges that many in the region would have seen as sort of religiously repugnant. But in Bombay, there are of course already pre-existing Muslim communities. There doesn't there's not a whole lot that one has to do to be able to make a case to have one's own mosque, for example, and they do have their own mosque, or to have a graveyard. So it's probably a little bit easier, but that probably has much more to do with the character of the city rather than the Gulf merchants themselves. Yeah, thank you.
Don't really know who raised the hand first, but
Lakshmi did.
iPhone Lakshmi. Who's iPhone Lakshmi? Is it Lakshmi S? Please go ahead, unmute yourself.
Maybe dinner time for iPhone Lakshmi. Yeah.
I think Dilip, you can start.
Yeah.
Okay. So Fahad, I mean, as usual, a brilliant paper, grand sweep. You take up Islam, trade, banking, a whole set of issues, and a vast geography. At three brief questions. I hope they are brief because I found the paper very engaging. One of the things that happens really in the study of merchants in India is that you're one kind of older history where the indigenous merchants are reduced to money lending after the land revenue settlements are introduced by the British. That's a kind of Washbrookian argument, or you have the Ashin Dasgupta argument, where the descendants of Ezekiel Rabi on the southwestern coast are reduced to penury in a generation. And now this opening up of actually looking at the Indian Ocean as still alive, despite the East India Company and the British, because of the flows that preceded colonialism and continued through colonialism and beyond colonialism. And this is a big theoretical argument to be made there about how do we think about the colonial as a kind of linchpin argument, right? I mean, and Eng Seng Ho has also suggested this earlier. So I think that's a temporal question, which is quite important. But the question that two questions that I really wanted to ask was, what's not clear in this is that you have the Arab merchants coming to Bombay, cosmopolitan city, creating these huge networks of credit and connections with the Islamic, the Nahda, as you put it, and a whole host of things like that. But what are they? Can we get any sense of their connections with indigenous merchant communities? So how did they relate to the other mercantile communities in Bombay? Were there any connections? And what exactly, or were these like enclaves so that the indigenous merchants perhaps die out, like in the older historiography? And then these new groups like the Armenians, whom Sebu Aslanian writes about, or the Arab merchants, and so on, then take over. So what are the connections? The second thing is that you don't speak about Southeast Asia very much. I mean, there's a way in which Arab, so there's an Arab connection with Bombay. When you mentioned the Ibn Bardan's fatwa, there you actually summoning up that Indian Ocean Islam thing where he's drawing on precedents from Java, for example. So in this story too, in your story too, does the geography extend to Southeast Asia, or is it just a straightforward connection between Bombay and the Arabian Peninsula? The third question, brief question, is about philanthropy, public investment, because a lot of the merchants in Bombay, as we know, like the Sassoons and so on, invested publicly in their presence in Bombay. What about Al-Sudairawi and other Arab merchants? Are there any artifacts that we have in any sense? So that's.
Yeah, no, these are excellent questions. I'll work my way backwards maybe. In terms of philanthropy, well, I actually have very little evidence of sort of public investments by Gulf merchants in Bombay. Although I will have to say I have to plead some ignorance, and that it's only in the last few months that I realized that there is a project to be written here. There's perhaps a book to be written on Khaliji Bombay. When I was doing my archival research in Bombay many years ago, I did spend some time with one of the last Kuwaiti consuls in the area, and he took me around and we saw different properties and things like that. And there was clearly something to learn there, but I was not doing that work at the time. the bits and pieces that I could pull out about Al-Sudairawi from the Times of India, for example. It's quite difficult to do these things because of the transliteration of names, as you know. It's not it's not always easy to identify these people. He at different times contributes. We have one notice in which he he donates I forget what some animal or bird to a zoological society. That's the one. That's the one glimpse of this that we get. But they do leave their imprint on the sort of the urban fabric of the city in various ways. If you drive down Marine Drive today, you see there's Al-Mubarak Court, Sabah Court. These are buildings that are named after different Kuwaiti rulers. The Kuwaiti consulate today is in the site of the former school, the former Arab school in Bombay, and this is in the Churchgate area. So it's there. But again, there's much more to be written about or to research. Southeast Asia, yeah, I've grappled with this forever. There does seem to be some sort of like segmentation of this Indian Ocean space. The Western Indian Ocean is it operates there. It has its own circuits, and those circuits are not. At times they intersect with circuits in the Eastern Indian Ocean, but very rarely. And of the 15,000 letters to Sudairawi, only 3 are from Surabaya. Actually, from a correspondent in Surabaya, and it's clear that they have nothing. Those have nothing to do with banking. It's like aid greetings. So it's a friend of his that's over there, rather than somebody who's actually woven into these circuits of banking. Their relationship to what you call indigenous merchant communities, I suppose Indian merchant communities. First. We have, just a ton of information on Gulf merchants in general doing business with Indian merchants. We have in different Gulf merchant archives, and I have collections. I use lots of different collections in the book that I'm writing now. You see that they're doing business with Indian merchants, jewelers, brokers. Around the coast of Western India, and sometimes the letters are oftentimes in Arabic. It's clear that these Indian merchants have an Arabic writer. Other times it may be that these Indian merchants also know Arabic, because you see it, and the Arabic is in a very very uncertain hand, we might say, very handwriting that lacks confidence. But then at times the letters are in English, and then we do have letters in Gujarati and other languages, other South Asian languages as well. So they're clearly part of this Indian, part of a broader Indian sort of mercantile fabric. And actually, one of the first things I recall the former consul, now passed away, Faisal bin Isa, telling me in Bombay was that we preferred to do business with the Indian merchants. I don't know what he meant by that. I think he was just being a bit cheeky. But there's very much a part of the same world. Sudairawi's archive, I should say, is very interesting in that respect. The materials that the family or whoever it was that digitized their materials, the materials that they chose to digitize were the Arabic materials. So you have 15,000 letters, all of which are in Arabic, which is, it doesn't make any sense, of course, right? That you would have this vast archive that's all in Arabic. Not even in English, right? And this is a man in Bombay. So it makes no sense. What's clear is that there was some selectivity in terms of what they thought was worthy of preservation. You can compare that to another archive that I work with, the archive of the merchant Mohammed bin Abdullah Matrouk in Basra. And his archive includes materials in Arabic, in Persian, in English, in Gujarati, in other languages. And this is a man in Basra. Surely in Bombay, it would have exhibited the same sort of heterogeneity. So, but this sort of colonial linchpin argument, this is something that again I'm sort of I grapple with. It's very clear that the work of these Gulf merchants maps onto an imperial geography very neatly, actually. And it's not like they're going to places where the British Empire is not active, right? The only place where we might plausibly say that they're going where there is not a strong British imperial presence is Basra. But Basra is so close to, I mean, Basra is it is the agrarian sort of center of the Gulf. This is where all of the agrarian wealth is being produced in the Gulf. And many of these merchants, although they are dealing in pearls, many of them are day traders, and they hold land in Basra because that's where you invest money. That is the principal form of investment is in land holding in Basra, because you can produce things that you can then sell elsewhere. But they don't go off into places where there's not a British imperial presence. It's clear that they're quite dependent on the good offices of British political agents in different places. So much so that there's a merchant in Aden, Khalid Abdul Latif Al-Hamid, who I also write about in my book. He is there, and he is going to he talks about the business that he does from Aden around the Horn of Africa. But he's very clear, he's very careful in interviews that he gives to say that, look, I went where there were where the British Empire, where there was, there's a British presence. I didn't go to these other places. I wouldn't want to go to those other places where there's not British presence. And he is, in some ways, many of these people have, it makes us uncomfortable, but a real sort of nostalgia for the British Empire. These are people who, like the Brits, they knew how to take care of business. They knew how to take care of business interests. Khalid Al-Hamid could not stop talking in his interview about how Aden was there were no customs duties. It was a free trade port. You could make money hand over fist. And all of these merchants that are stationed in Bombay seem to have no problem with the British Empire. So much so that even Rashid Rida, when he visits, seems to leave Bombay with a somewhat favorable impression of the British Empire. So it is these worlds do dovetail with one another quite nicely. And it may be that at this point, much of what these guys are doing are acting as commission agents to one another. They're brokering the flows of these different goods around the Indian Ocean. They're quite reliant on this imperial infrastructure in various ways. And so they see themselves as the principal beneficiaries of British expansion in the region, and they don't seem to have very much of a problem with it. But again, as I confront this in the material, I find myself to be quite uncomfortable with it, right? Because surely there are more sort of anti-colonialist sort of impulses within it, and yes, there are. These are these are people who are fueling discourses that then feed into the rise of Arab nationalism and anti-colonial discourses. But I don't think that they see themselves as that they see their activities as antithetical. Actually, they see themselves as fitting quite nicely with this British imperial expansion. It opens up a much broader space in which they can do their business. Yeah.
I think Lakshmi has questions that are connected. And after Lakshmi, may I call on Gautam Chakrabarti to ask his question?
Can I go ahead, Teju?
Yes, please, Lakshmi, go ahead.
Thanks, Fahad. I've always been an admirer of your work, and so I'm really looking forward to this new book. I have two sets of questions. If I'm audible, just let me know. I'm kind of curious about how you want to define Gulf capitalism. We've been hearing about small town capitalism. We've been hearing about vernacular capitalism. And we've had fairly substantive and deep work on both this. If you think of small town capitalism following Haynes's work on Western India, which is both Bombay, Surat, Ahmedabad, the entire stretch, he's really talking about hybrid forms of labor organization with capital investment. And there's a very clear case to be made for small town capitalism. On the other hand, I'm therefore curious as to how you would want to tell the story of these date trades that seem to happen. You say that that's a very important trade. So I'm kind of curious about what kind of organization is happening, how is it being funded, how is it being organized. So what are we actually talking about when we look at capitalism? That's one. I'm also very curious about the financial instrument story, which to me is the other important part of capitalism. And here, I'm very interested in looking at whether there was within those instruments a shift in the way in which they were written, worded, phrased. The reason I ask is that if you look at the 1920s and if you look at Gujarati hundis, there is a whole set of primers being written on making hundis at par and more admissible to British credit instruments, avoid certain legal problems. So I'm kind of curious about the internal developments that take place within the credit instruments. And I'm thinking of practice here, because I completely take your point about custom and law being not, being kind of not binaries, but sort of blending into one another. I'm sort of just curious, because if you look at the 1920s, you've got all these primers on Vyaj Dharm, on Hundi Dharm, on how to write, how to make it less litigious. So I'm kind of curious about a more dynamic history of the credit instruments you're talking about.
These are both excellent questions, Lakshmi, and I have to say that, and you know this, I've said this to you before. I am in awe of your scholarship, and I'm humbled. I'm humbled by your presence here, and I'm deeply grateful for everything that you've done. The question of capitalism is one that I've been thinking about for some time. What actually makes this, in a sense, capitalism? What we think of as Gulf, quote unquote, capitalism. I mean, it's hard to say. Often when we say capitalism, it becomes a shorthand for a lot of different things. Oftentimes in American literature, it becomes a shorthand for just making money, which is not capitalism at all. It's just making money. And so I'm not going to sort of make that connection there. What becomes clear is that the day trade itself, I should say, is becoming reorganized. The production in the day trade is becoming reorganized for export to particular markets, right? Different date farms are tagged for different markets around the Western Indian Ocean. There's an understanding that there are markets for particular varieties of dates that people are investing in growing for particular markets. There's a very keen sense of a market that's out there that is going to exist in the future, actually, and not right away. That there's a seasonal market that's going to emerge, and that they have to time the harvesting of dates in particular ways to coordinate with captains. There's a circulation of information, very tight coordination around this market for dates that's emerging. And this is something that I really sort of sketch out in some detail in this book that I'm writing, which is principally, actually, if it's about one thing, I will say, I mean, it's a connected history of the Gulf and Indian Ocean, but it's about the day trade. It really is about when I say the Dow trade is fundamentally a trade in dates. These merchants, they purchase property in the region, or around at the confluence of the Tigris and Euphrates. They're not actually purchasing. They have offices in Basra, but the farms themselves are south of Basra, between Basra and the Gulf. It's a long stretch of farms that they have. They're amassing an enormous amount of money, or enormous amount of land, as clearly land itself has become commodified in an enormous way because of the transformations in the global date trade. And they are hiring essentially sort of peasant laborers whom they're paying a wage to plant and to harvest these crops. And there's a constant tension between these merchant landlords and the peasants themselves, so much so that at different times it results in outright violence. One of the merchants that I write about, Mohammed al-Matruk, finds himself actually murdered by these peasants in the 1950s. So part of it is the reorganization of production through and that these merchants themselves are the conduits by which sort of production is reorganized for markets abroad. So we might think of it as a form of sort of commercial capitalism in that respect. The other part of it is that we see a distinct sort of, in different places, they are a part of a process by which different natural goods are being sort of commodified as well. In Calicut, they are sort of heavily involved in the commodification of timber. Actually, so the timber trade, the shipbuilding timber, house building timber. These merchants are involved in the establishment of different sort of grades and standards for timber. They tag it in different ways. They have different names for it. They're shuttling these to different markets for different purposes. This is the move from what William Cronin has called the move from first nature to second nature, right? The commodification of the natural world itself. So you see some aspects of this, and then of course there's the sort of the financialization of economic life in the Western Indian Ocean, the sort of circulation of different notes, the degree to which all of these activities are bound up in these money markets abroad, so much so that money itself becomes a commodity that these merchants are speculating in. When they write to one another, they're listing prices for different goods, and then they list prices for different currencies as well, because they're buying and selling money alongside their buying and selling those different goods. The transformation of the instruments question, I wish I had a better answer for you. I got to see it in great detail with the waraqas that I wrote about, right? As we think of what these people rethought, what these instruments should be able to do, might be able to do in a commercializing economy. With this particular material, that process is a little less clear to me, and so what I get are different debates surrounding, say, these financial instruments, say banknotes and hawalas, and what they're supposed to, what they mean. You have debates by people like Ibn Badran, people like Rashid Rida, and things like that. But I don't have nearly as much of a sense of the longer arc of it in this, and in part that's because I've not pursued that question. I didn't want this book to be a Sea of Debt 2.0. I wanted it to be something else, and I wanted to. It showcases a lot of different kinds of credit instruments, a lot of different kinds of contracts, lots of different kinds of archival materials and texts in the book. There are reflections after each chapter, reflections grounded in a particular kind of document to get us to think from the micro level. And it's all stuff that this one ship captain is, copying templates for into his own notebook and reflecting on. But it's not the same kind of story as a Sea of Debt, in which I'm able to sort of trace out a longer history of these things. All I can say is that I appreciate the question and the provocation, and I will have to give it much more thought than I can right now.
Gautam Chakrabarti, would you like to speak now? Go ahead.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yes. Thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me to ask, and thank you so much for this very interesting talk. Shukran jazeelan. I was interested, as the point mentioned by Dilip about the links between Arab merchants or Arab mercantile networks and those in Southeast Asia, which drew upon pre-colonial and early modern mercantile networks, Hawala, Hundi, the networks between Western India and Aden, and so on and so forth. I was wondering, to what extent, according to you or in your research, are medieval or even early medieval networks, which result from the famous Srivijaya Empire in Southeast Asia, in what is today Malaysia and Indonesia, and the Chola conquest of the Srivijaya Empire, and the networks which result and which continue in modified forms through the Bahmani and Vijayanagar periods in southern India, to what extent are actual practices, to what extent are there continuities in actual trading practices as seen in your research, number one? And number two, the other community which comes from the Near East, from West Asia, and plays a major role in mercantile and industrial networks, which also sort of, quote unquote, piggyback on colonial metropoles, colonial coastal maritime cities, Bombay, Shanghai, Aden, and so on and so forth. The Baghdadi Jews, for example, who become very prominent certainly in Bombay, but also in Calcutta and other parts of India from the late 18th, early 19th century onwards. So to what extent would Khaliji merchants interact or not with Baghdadi Jewish merchants and industrialists? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Gautam, for these excellent questions. I have to admit that I don't have an excellent answer for you for either one, but especially for the first. The continuities in trading practices from the early medieval period, these are not apparent to me at all in the material that I'm looking at, I should say. The material that I look at clusters around the 19-teens and 1920s, and they are and the book itself, the book that I'm writing, is very much we might say sort of a thick description of this world in the 19-teens and 1920s, especially in the early 1920s, set against the backdrop of a much longer history of connection between the Gulf and Indian Ocean. But where I see echoes of a medieval a history of medieval connection is actually principally in the connections that people see between Aden and Calicut, which are also trading partners, as you well know, in the medieval period. The merchants that these Gulf businessmen do associate with in the Malabar coast are principally merchants of Hadrami descent, Yemeni descent, right? In Calicut, they do very close business with one particular family, the Barami family, and these are a family of sort of ship-owning merchants that become shipbuilders themselves. They own shipyards, and the network, the sort of the density of the network is quite clear in the Aden Calicut vector. But beyond that, I don't really see anything that immediately suggests to me, at least, any sort of echoes of the medieval past. And then with Southeast Asia, again, to the point that I made to Dilip, it's a very frustrating aspect of the story for me, actually, because I want to see connections to the eastern half of the Indian Ocean, but they simply don't emerge from the material, except in some of the commodities that these merchants are doing business in, that they're sending out of Bombay, for example. A very popular one is the Javanese sugar, that they're sukkar jawi, as they say, and then which they're importing by way of steamship, of course, and then re-exporting to the Gulf. The connections to the Baghdadi Jews, there are some tantalizing hints, I should say. There are money orders to address to Sudairawi from members of the Sassoon family, to David Sassoon specifically, and then the merchants in Basra are receiving letters from members of the Sassoon family in Bombay as well. It's there. It's not. It's a very small part of the material that we see, but like I said, it's very sort of tantalizing hints of the connections to these particular communities. And I know that what is his name? Sassoon, the professor, was Joseph Sassoon, or he's recently published a book on the Sassoon family, and that really sort of thinks of the sort of 19th and 20th century histories of the Sassoon family. And I'm sort of waiting to get my hands on it to be able to sort of write them into this story a little bit more. Clearly a part of this world, but how much so is harder to tell. Thank you, though. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for those answers. Thank you.
Dilip, over to you again. Unmute yourself.
You're muted, Dilip.
I had a question about what occasioned the Sheikh Dhawan asking Ibn Bardan for the fatwa, right? I mean, so there's this whole issue of zakat. Can banknotes, postal transfers, were they to be considered money and so on? So was there a kind of, this relates back to my question about philanthropy and charity, those kinds of issues.
Yeah.
So is the volume of zakat increasing at this point? What occasions this question?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I mean, the problem with the genre of the fatwa is that we don't get the reasoning behind the question. You can only speculate as to you get the question and you get the answer. And if you're lucky, you get you get a sense of who asked the question. You get a name and you get a date and a place. And we get that with the Rashid Rida question. We get a name and a date and a place. Muqbil al-Dakhir, 1902, Bahrain. With Ibn Badran, it is very much like the standard fatwa that you get, the istifta, which is the question, is subject to a process which we call tajreed, which basically is a sort of anonymization or a genericization of the question, such that it could be one that's posed by anybody, right? We know, of course, that most likely, because we know that merchants are posing these questions around the Indian Ocean at this time, and actually a contemporary in the Gulf has posed the question to Rashid Rida as well. We know that it's most likely a merchant in Kuwait who's asking this. Why are they asking it? And you're right that this does connect to the question of philanthropy. I somehow not connected the two in my head, zakat and philanthropy. But I think what's animating the question, I should say, is the fact that much of the money that is being handled at that point in time is in the form of banknotes, right? Much of it's not there are the commodities that are circulating, but in terms of the profits in some ways become almost cloaked to the point of invisibility by these banknotes, right? It's not like there's actual money, there are coins that are changing hands from time to time, but much of it is book debt and then financial transfers in the form of these banknotes. And then the question that may have been posed is, do we owe money on this? Do we owe zakat? Do we have zakat obligations on these particular kinds of instruments that constitute the principal mode by which we are circulating money to one another in the Indian Ocean? It's not because the banknote itself does not fall under the sort of the classical forms of money that people would understand. Gold, silver, wheat, barley, salt, all of these things are forms of understood to be forms of money, actually, and that one owes zakat on. But these banknotes themselves, it's kind of unclear, right? Because the question again, and this is why Ibn Badran rephrases the question, is like, is this stuff actually money, or is it simply a representation of some other kind of transaction that's taking place? And this is why the question for him, which I found much more interesting, the answer for him that he gave than to Rashid Rida's, although Ibn Badran is a far less prominent figure. The question is about intrinsic value, right? Do these things have intrinsic value? Gold, silver, wheat, barley, salt, all of the other sort of classical money forms have what he understands to be intrinsic value. These pieces of paper have no intrinsic value, right? And they stand in. Yeah.
So if I understand you correctly, these are probably zakat dodgers who are writing who are trying to find out
Yes.
whether
Yes.
the money that they're accumulating, whether they need to pay out on that or not.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, I got
And
it.
this is why Hayyan forwards the request to Ibn Badran. You know, you don't want to be the person who's responsible for the answer. Especially, I mean, these guys are quite powerful. These are the major landlords. These are the people who are, you know, I should say, in terms of their philanthropy. Their philanthropy is quite visible in the Gulf itself. These India-based merchants, they are the ones who established the first schools in the Gulf, the hospitals. Many of the first banks in the Gulf are the ones that they're establishing. They engage in all sorts of charitable activities. They endow all sorts of waqfs in the Gulf rather than in Bombay. That part is very clear, but only because there's like a massive local historiography on these sorts of things. But this is like a power block that you simply don't want to take on. If you have any aspirations whatsoever, it's like this is career suicide to take on the merchants. You don't want to be the one issuing the answer. So if you say is, you know what, I'll forward it to somebody else. I'm sorry, what he said, you know, if what he says is not to your liking, although you know the answer that Ibn Badran gives, and maybe he's sensitive to the environment in the Gulf, is actually quite favorable to the zakat dodger. He says like, no, this is not money. Don't worry about it. You don't know anything, right?
We actually have some seconds in which I would like to make an announcement. Our next speakers actually Edward Simpson from SOAS and Camp, which is an artist collective in Mumbai. This will be on November 25th, about a month from now. We don't yet have their abstract, but we will be circulating that information very soon along with the link for registration. So hope to see you there. Thank you all, those of you who have been following the series. That's really fabulous. Thanks to those who have come here for the first time today. We hope you will stay with us. And a million thanks to Fahad Bishara for being our 4th star in the series. Yeah.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you so
Thank
much.
you so much for the opportunity, everybody, and thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye bye all.